In Paris 1924, poet and critic André Breton published a document influenced by early understandings of how the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, concluded the human subconscious worked. This document kickstarted an international political and intellectual movement which would become one of the new driving forces of the art world. This published document was to be known as the Manifesto of Surrealism. The key point of the 6-page manifesto was to argue against rationalism as being the only form of understanding and processing the world around us, and that other elements of our being such as irrationalism and absurdism are just as credible dialects for processing and understanding our reality. There were many painters, sculptors, poets, and artists of all kinds during the 1920s who took on implementing surrealism into their work. René Magritte, Joan Miró, Max Ernst. But in this video I am going to be zoning in on two specific figures that spawned from this era: Spanish surrealist artist Salvador Dali and Spanish-Mexican filmmaker Luis Buñuel. The basis of who Salvador Dali was needs no introduction, but to put it briefly, born in Spain 1904, Dali was a surrealist painter renowned for his technical skill and bizarre memorable images. Luis Buñuel, born in Spain 1900, was a highly political avant-garde filmmaker whose work spanned across the nations of France, Mexico, and Spain, and is considered to be one of the greatest and most influential filmmakers of the 20th century. A lot of the substance of this man's work revolved around criticizing, challenging, and satirizing mainstream religious, social, and bourgeoisie conventions and values. In 1917, Buñuel was studying philosophy at the University of Madrid, where he met a young Salvador Dali. Together, the two of them formed an intellectual group alongside poet Federico Garcia Lorca, where they would go head-to-head against each other in debating topics revolving around society, politics, religion, art, and so on. A key subject that they were all interested in for this context was the formation and development of surrealist art. Through Dali's and Buñuel's creative and jealousy-ridden competition, a friendship was born between them, and in the early days of surrealist art, Luis Buñuel even ended up being the subject of a Salvador Dali portrait piece. In 1929, Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali wrote a script together for what is considered to be the first ever piece of surrealist cinema, as well as one of the most famous short films ever created. A film which was completely financed by Buñuel's mother, Uchén Andalú, or as it would be known in the English language, an Andalusian dog, is a film void of an overarching narrative or plot, and is a collection of incoherent, illogical, surreal scenarios based directly from dreams that Buñuel and Dali had. The series of scenes is strung together with absolutely no coherent chronological order, expressing strong symbolic images from their subconscious minds. Though this film is a piece of avant-garde art in its own right, this film should also be considered an experiment in defying the main fundamentals that at the time Hollywood, German Expressionism, and even other avant-garde cinematic movements had put in place, and its cinematic language, which operated through a form of dream logic, had kickstarted a butterfly effect that changed the entire course of cinema history throughout the 20th century. The birth of the surrealist cinema movement in Spain not only paved the way for the surrealist elements that appear in Buñuel's later and more coherently structured social-political films, but paved the way for the rest of the highly influential filmmakers of the 20th century who incorporated surrealism into their fundamental cinematic language. Federico Fellini, Alejandro Jodorowsky, David Lynch, the list would be enormous, making it pointless for me to attempt to name any more. Upon the first initial public screening of Un Chien Andalou, Buñuel was so scared of the audience's reaction to the film that upon entering the cinema, he filled his pockets with stones so that in case the audience had a negative reaction to his film, he would retaliate by throwing stones at the audience. Little did he know Un Chien Andalou was met with a heavy round of applause, and André Breton's enthusiastic reaction to the film's implementation of surrealism would end up being the cause of both Buñuel and Dali's official entrance into Breton's declared surrealist movement. In 1930, Buñuel was given funding to create his next film. He had been given a great deal of freedom, and upon the writing of the script he contacted Dali to work with him once again, but due to creative differences they did not end up getting along, and nobody on board with the project approved of any of Salvador Dali's ideas. The two parted ways, and Buñuel was left to complete 90% of the script by himself. Upon the release of The Age of Gold, there was controversy due to increasing right-wing views among the press and law authorities, who were against the nature of surrealist art and what it might stand for on a political and ideological level. The screening of the film was stormed by protesters, and black ink was splashed upon the cinema screen. The theatre lobby had been decorated with work by surrealist painters, some of which were by Dali. The work was tragically destroyed. The chief of police had the film banned in Spain, and the film wasn't unbanned until 50 years later, only a couple years before the death of Louis Buñuel. In 1934, an art exhibition in New York City was organized by a renowned art dealer named Julian Levy, which featured Dali's iconic piece, The Persistence of Memory. The piece was very well received by the public at the time and turned Salvador Dali into an international sensation and one of the 20th century's most iconic and recognizable celebrity painters. Dali continued to spark up the art scene and caused bizarre public scandals everywhere he ended up traveling in America. But as his continuous global success throughout the mid-1930s went on like a psychedelic-operated freight train, we are going to avert our gaze back to Dali's home country, where his ex-collaborator Buñuel had found himself in the midst of conflict. Up until the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, Louis Buñuel had playfully dabbled in communist, socialist, and anarchist ideology. But as the war in Spain began, it was clear to Buñuel that Spain appeared to him to be in a pre-revolutionary state. The Spanish Civil War began when generals Emilio Mola and Francisco Franco started an uprising dedicated to overthrowing Spain's democratically elected republic. Buñuel openly embraced the side of the Republic, as he was very unhappy with the current social-political climate in Spain, as evident in his 1933 pseudo-documentary film, Land Without Bread, which depicted a Spain ridden by poverty and disease. Louis Buñuel kickstarted his career as a surrealist filmmaker where he pulled his ideas from the subconscious, but it was here he was now forced to pull his ideas from the objective reality surrounding him and his country. In 1939, after the Republic had lost in the Spanish Civil War, Buñuel, along with his wife and son, were forced into exile and vowed to never return to fascist Spain again. He remained in exile all the way up until 1960. Buñuel and his family moved to the United States using funding that he obtained from his old patrons, the Nollies. In the United States, he struggled to find meaningful work in Hollywood, where he was suggested to try teaching technical advice by a Spanish ambassador. In the 1940s, he eventually ended up in New York City, where he worked at the film department at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art. But during 1940s New York, whilst Salvador Dali flourished as one of the most influential celebrity artists of the 20th century, Louis Buñuel essentially struggled for his entire time spent in the United States. Dali's fame and wealth ended up leading Buñuel to contact Dali in order to ask him for a loan for one of his projects, to which Dali denied and allegedly gave Buñuel a very preachy lecture on the virtues of thrift. Buñuel was then fired from his job at MoMA after Dali went around blithely calling Buñuel an atheist. Louis Buñuel, in a fit of fury, went over to Dali's hotel room with the intention of beating the living shit out of him, but as soon as he got to the front door, Buñuel knew that he didn't have it in him to throw arms with Dali. This was the end of Dali's and Buñuel's relationship for the time being, which ended on a rather negative, distasteful note between the two of them. Despite the trials and tribulations the two of these fellas had, the rest of their life paths were somewhat positive. Due to Louis Buñuel being blacklisted from the United States for being a communist whilst the Cold War was getting heated, he was forced to relocate to Mexico, where he would gain citizenship in 1949. He was welcomed into the Mexican film industry with open arms, where he would produce what are considered to be some of the most essential films in the history of art house cinema: The Exterminating Angel, The Brute, The Young and the Damned, and many others, where he would strategically and expertly slide his leftist political ideas and themes into the melodramatic films in such subversive ways that the film producers in Mexico were not able to bat an eye. He would also end up making films in France, where I personally believe he reached his peak artistry with surrealist social political dramas and comedies such as Belle de Jour, The Discreet Charm of a Bourgeoisie, and That Obscure Object of Desire, all of which are magnificent staples in European art house cinema history, that even won Buñuel an Academy Award in the United States for Best Foreign Language Film. Not that winning an Oscar would mean anything to Mr. Buñuel. Meanwhile, during this era, Salvador Dali remained in the United States, where his work shifted into exploring religious themes and using erotic subject matter as a means for exploring his repressed childhood memories. Though his work was continuously breaking technical achievements, his paintings from the 1950s onwards were never as highly regarded or received as much as his early work during the breakout of the Surrealist movement. Throughout these following years, Dali would occasionally reach out to Buñuel via letters, one of which asked of Buñuel if he would like to collaborate in creating a spiritual sequel to Un Chien Andalou, to which Buñuel responded, "Water that has passed can no longer turn the mill." The year was 1979. Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel were now but old men, who were about to meet each other for the first time in years within the city of Paris. Unfortunately, a few days before meeting with hopes to reignite their friendship, both of them coincidentally fell ill at the same time and were forced to cancel their trip to Paris. Both of them would end up dying within a couple years of each other during the 1980s, without ever reconciling the beef and boiled blood between the two of them. What is to take away from the story of their friendship that fell apart? That I will leave up to you.